Welcome back to this Paper Connections investigation. Today we open the second chapter of our historical series, The Long Autumn of the Serenissima. In Episode 1, we established the physical architecture of the Venetian Empire. Today we go deeper. We will eventually look through the lens of two surviving merchant letters from 1772, but first we must understand the grand, shifting, macro-historical stage upon which this perfect commercial machinery was operating.
Right, and to do that, you have to picture the lagoon in the deep midwinter of 1772.
Yeah.
It is a fascinating scene. The immense arsenal, the state shipyard that once possessed the terrifying industrial capacity to churn out a fully armed war galley in a single day, is eerily quiet.
Basically functioning more as a museum of past glories than an active military installation at this point.
Exactly. It is a museum. And the great patrician families, the direct descendants of men who ruthlessly conquered the Mediterranean, they are actively gambling away their massive fortunes at the card tables of the Rialto. And yet, beneath this decadent facade of a supposedly dying empire, there is an invisible, flawlessly efficient machine of transalpine paper credit. And it is humming louder and more precisely than ever.
Which is such a paradox.
It really is. To understand this specific historical moment, you must cast aside any preconceptions of late-stage Venice as a chaotic or collapsing state. In 1772, the Republic of Venice was a beautiful, superbly functioning antique. It was an institutional masterpiece operating with a quiet, everyday efficiency that had been meticulously constructed over half a millennium.
We're obligated to pause here, I think, and truly dissect the sheer gravity of that legacy. Because when we speak of the Serenissima, we're speaking of the empire that ruthlessly ruled the Eastern Mediterranean for 5 uninterrupted centuries.
Yes, 500 years of absolute maritime dominance.
Exactly. This is the state that engaged in 4 catastrophic, world-defining maritime wars against the Genoese. Conflicts culminating in the existential siege of Chioggia. And they emerged victorious, establishing an absolute iron-fisted monopoly over the spice trade flowing between the Levant and Western Europe.
Oh, and do not forget the Fourth Crusade.
Right, 1204.
Yes, in the year 1204, they orchestrated the capture of Constantinople. That event remains, frankly, the most calculating, ruthless, and lucrative redirection of military power ever witnessed in Christian Europe.
They literally stripped the Byzantine Empire of its wealth, just packed it onto galleys and installed themselves as the masters of the archipelago.
They did, and beyond that brute geopolitical force, this is the exact civilization that essentially engineered the very operating system of the modern commercial world.
The financial architecture.
Yes, they gave Western Europe the legal framework of the joint stock venture, specifically the commenda, which allowed investors to share risk without ever physically going to sea.
Which changes everything.
It changes everything. They perfected the bill of exchange, completely divorcing the transfer of wealth from the physical movement of dangerous, heavy coinage. But, most profoundly, they exported the epistemological revolution of double-entry bookkeeping.
Right, separating the flow of capital into dare and avere, debits and credits.
Precisely. By doing that, they transformed commerce. It ceased to be a chaotic series of physical gambles reliant on the whims of weather and pirates, and it became a rigorous, calculable, mathematical science.
Yet, if you look at the diplomatic and naval registries of 1772, a staggering paradox emerges, one that is almost offensive to the logic of statecraft. We are looking at a state that has become profoundly, terminally isolated.
A republic of barely 3 million inhabitants.
Yes, exactly. It is militarily obsolete. It possesses a fleet of aging galleys entirely incapable of facing the massive ships of the line fielded by contemporary great powers.
Right. The British or the French fleets would have decimated them.
Oh, without question. And because of that, it wields absolutely zero diplomatic weight at the great peace congresses where the borders of the world are now being drawn.
Not at all.
So how does a state completely stripped of its coercive maritime power continue to command a vast transalpine economic network? It defies the fundamental mercantilist law that trade inevitably follows the flag.
Well, that paradox is the central mystery of our investigation today.
Yeah.
And to properly frame that mystery, we really need to map the macro-historical stage of 1772, because it is a year undergoing a violent, rapid, and global transformation.
The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting.
Massively. For when the 7 Years' War has recently concluded its global combustion, and we have to remember, this was not a regional European conflict, it was the first true world war.
Ranging from the Americas to India.
Exactly. It permanently redrew the map of global power, shifting vast territories and commercial monopolies from the dense forests of Pennsylvania and Quebec straight to the Carnatic coast of Bengal. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans are now firmly under the dominion of aggressive, heavily armed nation-states.
And simultaneously, if we look back at Europe, the great autocratic courts of St. Petersburg, Berlin, and Vienna are engaged in this highly cynical secret diplomacy.
Oh, the partition.
Right. They are actively finalizing the first partition of Poland. It is an act of sheer geopolitical erasure that will soon shock the continent. I mean, they are casually dismembering a sovereign state simply because they possess the military mass to do so.
While to the west, the French monarchy is blindly, almost systematically, sliding toward the fatal structural financial crisis that will eventually dismantle the absolute state entirely.
But the shifting paradigms are not exclusively military or political, right? They are technological and intellectual as well.
Oh, absolutely. Look at Britain. In Birmingham, James Watt has just recently patented his separate condenser steam engine.
Which is a monumental leap.
It is the hinge of history. He is actively unleashing the thermodynamic forces that will permanently sever human industry from the natural limitations of wind, water, and muscle.
And intellectually, you have Adam Smith.
Right. Meanwhile, up in Kirkcaldy, Adam Smith is sitting at his desk drafting the foundational chapters of The Wealth of Nations. He is actively articulating a new economic reality, one of free markets, an industrial division of labor.
An ideology that will soon render the highly regulated, guild-based commercial capitalism of the Mediterranean entirely obsolete.
Completely obsolete.
Which firmly establishes the strict boundary for our analysis. I want to be clear to you listening, this documentary is not merely a narrow translation of two pieces of 18th century paper. It is a forensic autopsy of a commercial civilization operating at the absolute upper limit of its institutional capacity.
Precisely in the late afternoon of its long day.
Exactly. We are examining a perfect machine running flawlessly on the very eve of its total destruction.
But the Republic's inability to defend its own interests did not manifest overnight. We have to be clear about that. To properly read the letters of 1772, we must cross the 21-year historical bridge from 1751.
Which is the baseline year we established in our previous investigation.
Right. We have to meticulously examine the three quiet, almost invisible threats that systematically eroded the Republic's foundations during those intervening decades.
Let us dive into the first of those quiet threats, which emerges directly from the global conflict you just outlined. The 7 Years' War, which tore through the world from 1756 to 1763.
Yes.
Throughout this massive global conflagration, the Venetian Senate maintained a strict, unyielding adherence to armed neutrality.
And this was not a sudden temporary pivot for them.
No, not at all. It was a rigid state policy that had been heavily entrenched since the 1699 Treaty of Karlowitz. Basically, when Venice recognized it could no longer bleed its treasury dry fighting the Ottomans.
Armed neutrality is such a fascinating high-wire act of defensive statecraft. I mean, the Republic adamantly refused to engage in the dynastic and colonial bloodletting of the massive European powers.
Which sounds wise on paper.
Well, initially, this policy resulted in an immediate, staggering commercial boom for the Venetians. It really paid off. While British, French, and Spanish merchant ships were ruthlessly hunted, boarded, and seized by privateers across the world's oceans, the Venetian merchant marine sailed in absolute safety.
Because they flew the Golden Lion flag of San Marco.
Exactly. Under that neutral flag, Venetian merchants stepped in as the uncontested middlemen for the Levant. They were safely carrying the massive bulk commodities, cotton, silk, spices, that would normally have been transported in the holds of the belligerent nations.
Furthermore, the massive overland trade routes extending from the Adriatic deep into Germany were permanently rerouted by the war. Because the broad Saxon plains had become a primary, devastated theater of artillery and cavalry warfare, commercial traffic entirely bypassed the traditional, highly lucrative Leipzig fairs.
Nobody wants to drag valuable cargo through a war zone.
Right. So the flow of continental goods was securely redirected southward, solidifying along the Augsburg-Vienna-Nuremberg axis. And this is the exact commercial corridor that the merchants in our archival letters will utilize.
It is. But if you examine the diplomatic archives from those specific years, you realize that this immense commercial profitability masked a devastating geopolitical cost.
The bill comes due.
Yes. The Republic completely surrendered its diplomatic relevance. Because Venice rigidly refused to bleed on the battlefields, it was humiliatingly barred from the negotiating tables at the treaties of Paris and Hubertusburg in 1763.
They were simply not invited to the rooms where the world was being divided.
Not even sent a chair. Furthermore, their supposedly sacred armed neutrality was increasingly viewed as a pathetic technicality by aggressive emerging powers.
Right, the Russians.
Exactly. During the parallel Russo-Ottoman conflicts of the late 1760s, heavily armed Russian privateers freely and repeatedly boarded San Marco-flagged merchant ships right in the Adriatic and the Aegean.
The mechanism of this humiliation is striking. I mean, the Russian captains would confiscate Venetian cargoes entirely under the flimsy pretext of searching for Ottoman contraband.
And what could Venice do?
Well, the Venetian Senate protested these violations vehemently through official diplomatic channels. They drafted beautifully worded letters of outrage to St. Petersburg.
Beautiful letters, but no cannons to back them up.
Precisely. The reality was painfully clear to every single monarch in Europe. Venice possessed no formidable navy to enforce its sovereignty. It was a trading empire relying entirely on the polite, temporary restraint of heavily armed predators.
And empires naturally abhor a vacuum. While Venetian ships were being harassed in their own ancestral waters, the Habsburgs were quietly building a safe harbor just up the Adriatic coast. Which brings us to the second invisible threat.
The rapid, deliberate rise of Trieste.
Yes. In 1719, the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI declared Trieste a free port. For decades, the Venetian Senate dismissed it as a minor nuisance, a muddy village with poor anchorage.
A total miscalculation.
A fatal one. Because under the aggressive state-sponsored development programs of Empress Maria Theresa and her co-regent Joseph II, Trieste was methodically transformed into a formidable existential competitor.
The Habsburg strategy in Trieste is an absolute masterclass in economic warfare, because they did not merely build deeper docks or offer standard tariff exemptions, they literally weaponized the concept of religious tolerance.
Which was revolutionary for a Catholic empire.
It was. The Habsburg state issued formal, codified imperial decrees explicitly protecting Greek Orthodox, Sephardic Jewish, Armenian, and Italian Catholic merchants alike.
They offered a legally binding state-sponsored sanctuary.
Right. And that stood in stark contrast to Venice's traditional, highly regulated model of market integration.
That contrast is vital to understand. Venice relied on what we might term an unofficial embedded counting house tolerance. The Republic absolutely possessed a working multi-confessional commercial sector, but it operated within a rigid, deeply archaic framework of physical segregation.
The physical barriers were very real.
Very real. Jewish merchants were locked in the ghetto at night. Ottoman and German merchants were restricted to their specific, heavily supervised fondaci. They were subject to discriminatory statutes and special taxes.
Whereas Trieste offered modernity.
Exactly. Trieste offered the modern legal certainty of imperial protection and civic integration. The Habsburg state was not declaring a military war on the Venetian Republic. They were executing a polite, methodical, and devastatingly effective poaching of Venice's vital, multi-confessional mercantile base.
Which leaves Venice bleeding human capital. And that actually transitions perfectly into the third threat eroding the Republic. This one was entirely internal, a profound demographic and cultural hollowing out of the Venetian ruling class itself.
Yes, we are speaking of the patriciate, the elite names inscribed in the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book of the Maggiore Concilio.
For centuries, this hereditary aristocratic class was the highly specialized administrative and maritime engine of the empire. I mean, a Venetian patrician was educated from childhood to command the galley convoys, to manage heavily fortified overseas colonies in the Peloponnese, and to personally absorb the brutal, lethal risks of maritime commerce.
They were warrior merchants.
But by the 1760s and 1770s, the archival evidence shows a massive systemic diversion of patrician capital and human energy. The great families were quietly withdrawing their wealth from the perilous, unpredictable risks of the sea.
Seeking the safe, slow, guaranteed returns of mainland agriculture.
Exactly. When you study this specific generation, you see a class living almost entirely on the bravery of their ancestors.
Oh, that is so accurate.
They traded the terrifying, world-defining sieges of the Mediterranean for the absolute thrill of arguing with tenant farmers over crop yields. I mean, the patricians of 1772 were collecting agricultural rents in magnificent, perfectly symmetrical Palladian terra firma estates, or squandering those rents at the gaming tables of the Rialto.
The contrast is jarring.
We have to contrast the men of 1772 with their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. These were the men who stood unflinching behind the cannons during the harrowing apocalyptic siege of Famagusta in 1571, or who endured the grueling 24-year defense of Candia that ended in 1669.
A 24-year siege.
Yeah.
Just unfathomable resilience.
Right. And the institutional machinery they were effortlessly managing in 1772 was built entirely on a foundation of extreme physical risk and violent sacrifice. A sacrifice that the current generation was fundamentally no longer willing to endure.
It is a terminal demographic retreat into comfort. The system was no longer being replenished with the aggressive risk-taking human capital that had forged it. The political class was hollowing out from the inside over generations.
But no one noticed.
No, because the bureaucratic administration of the state remained remarkably competent. The clerks were still excellent. So this hollowing was entirely invisible to the outside world until the exact moment it was decisively too late.
Well, with that grand, shifting macro-historical stage securely set, and the erosion of the Republic's foundations clearly mapped, we can now narrow our focus. We look directly through the designated lens of our investigation. We turn our attention northward, across the Alps, to the free imperial city of Augsburg.
Yes, and to the institutional legacy that governed it. Augsburg is not a random geographic location for this story. It is absolutely essential to this narrative. It possessed a deep ancestral 300-year connection to Venice.
A massive commercial artery.
Yes, forged by the legendary Fugger and Welser banking dynasties in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Those massive South German banking fortunes, which financed emperors and popes, were entirely predicated on financial techniques absorbed directly from the Venetian Republic.
And they learned those precise techniques at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the massive chartered exchange house situated squarely on the Rialto in Venice.
We truly cannot overstate the importance of the Fondaco.
It was not merely a warehouse where German merchants stored bulk copper and silver. It was the mandatory educational crucible of European finance.
An absolute crucible.
It was an institution specifically designed by the Venetian Senate to force every single German merchant to reside, transact, and be strictly supervised within its walls. By locking them into this highly controlled environment, the Republic created an ecosystem where Italian commercial capitalism, the bill of exchange, the double entry ledger, the strict mechanisms of credit, was systematically transmitted northward across the Alps to a captive audience.
And that profound institutional legacy, built century by century inside the Fondaco, is the invisible operating system for the correspondence we're about to examine.
Which brings us to the author.
Yes, we now introduce the author of our archival letters, Giovanni Battista Padron. He's a Catholic Italian, a second-tier commission merchant who has permanently left the Italian peninsula and firmly established his counting house in the Lutheran-free imperial city of Augsburg.
So, if we pull the first surviving letter from the archive, the date is February 22, 1772. It is penned on heavy rag paper, written in iron gall ink, and addressed to his principal, Carlo Merci, residing in Venice. We are going to execute a forensic analysis of the logistics detailed in this specific document.
Padron opens the correspondence by acknowledging the receipt and onward forwarding of a specific physical shipment sent by Merci. The Italian text reads, Cassatina Canocchiali numero 2, CP.
Which translates from the commercial Italian to a small specific case containing 2 Galileo-style optical telescopes.
I have to point out the profound, almost literary historical irony embedded in this specific cargo. Venice, a state that is entirely blind to its own approaching geopolitical demise, a state unaware that it has barely 2 decades of existence left, is actively exporting precision optical instruments specifically engineered for seeing far.
It is a spectacularly poetic contradiction. They can manufacture lenses to see the stars, but they cannot see the armies massing on their borders.
Exactly. But the physical reality of moving those telescopes reveals the staggering, everyday efficiency of the Transalpine logistics network. Padron meticulously details the mechanisms of the Brenner Post.
The postal route over the mountains?
Right. The telescopes were forwarded by an independent transit agent, the Notarino Giuseppe Bizzi. This required coordinating horse relays to carry the fragile optics across the treacherous, freezing altitudes of the Brenner Pass in the absolute dead of winter.
Navigating tolls, snowdrifts, armed patrols.
All for a box of glass lenses.
And the moment the case is received by Padron in Augsburg, he does not hold it. He immediately redispatches it to a partner firm, Iosiano Toder & Company, located in Regensburg. And Regensburg is strategically crucial here.
Because of the river?
Yes, it sits directly on the Danube. This allows the telescopes to be seamlessly distributed downstream into the vast Habsburg terrestrial markets of Vienna and beyond.
However, if you read further down the parchment, the most revealing aspect of this first letter is not the physical cargo at all. It is Padron's explicit, almost irritated refusal to engage in a specific type of business.
He sounds quite annoyed.
He does. Merci has clearly been pressuring him in previous letters to handle minor banking drafts and bills of exchange on his behalf. Padron pushes back with rigid professional clarity. He writes, "My trade is not in exchange, but in the procurement of these linens and manufactures."
He completely dismisses the banking requests outright.
He states that balancing those specific ledgers brings far more trouble than the meager commission deserves.
I want to pull on that specific thread because it is utterly fascinating. Why would an ambitious merchant flatly turn down a request from his primary principal in Venice? What does this firm, documented rejection reveal about the architecture of late 18th century European commerce?
Well, it reveals a highly mature, late-stage separation of commercial disciplines. If you look at the 16th century, a great merchant house like the Fuggers would handle both physical merchandise, spices, copper, textiles, and sovereign banking as a unified monopolistic operation.
They did everything.
Right. But by the late 18th century, the system had evolved into a state of strict specialization. Padron is explicitly defining himself as a merchandise merchant. He is completely distinct from the specialist exchange bankers who exclusively brokered paper credit.
He knows his lane.
He is vigorously defending the boundaries of his specific trade within a highly evolved, heavily segmented economic ecosystem. He refuses to deviate.
Moving from the physical logistics of Alpine transit and Galileo's telescopes, we now transition to the invisible, flawless architecture of paper credit that actually governed this ecosystem. We open the second archival letter, dated March 7, 1772.
And this document is the absolute financial heart of our investigation. If you look closely at the ledger entries Padron meticulously records, a staggering reality emerges.
He lists specific settlements, right?
Yes. 506 florins, 17 cruiser. 90 florins, 54 cruiser, 28 florins, 35 cruiser. And finally, a consolidated draft of 616 florins.
To understand the true weight of these figures, we must understand the currency standard they were utilizing. Padron is not dealing with arbitrary local coins. He is calculating his massive ledgers using the Convenzionsmünze standard.
Precisely. The Convenzionsmünze was the monetary treaty agreed upon in 1753. This treaty rigidly locked the South German gulden or florin to exactly 11.7 grams of fine silver.
So it was standardized across borders.
Completely. It created a highly stable, universally recognized, metallurgically precise accounting unit across the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire and the vast Habsburg lands. Padron uses it without explanation because it's the absolute bedrock of their commercial reality. Both he and Mariston know exactly how much fine silver is theoretically represented by every stroke of the pen.
But the true marvel of this letter is the mechanism of how these immense sums are actually settled. As we unpack the text, we observe a staggering, flawless, multilateral clearing operation.
It is a web.
It really is. Padron in Augsburg, Merci in Venice, Toder in Regensburg, a banker named Schön in Nuremberg, and several unnamed correspondents in Vienna are actively settling massive interconnected debts simultaneously.
They are executing this complex clearing across 4 sovereign cities and 3 distinct regional currencies.
Walk us through the mechanism.
Well, it works like this. Padron owes Merci for textiles. Merci owes a different merchant in Vienna for raw materials. That Viennese merchant owes Schön in Nuremberg for manufactured goods.
In a less evolved system, this would be a physical nightmare.
A total nightmare. It would require loading heavily guarded wooden chests of physical silver coinage onto wagons and dragging them back and forth across the Alps. That primitive method invites highway theft, incurs massive border tolls, and risks total loss in the snow.
Instead, they simply offset the interconnected debts against one another purely on paper.
It is an absolute masterpiece of abstract financial netting. 0 physical silver actually crosses the mountains to settle these accounts. The entire transalpine economy is suspended on a web of profound, verified trust in notarized paper, recognized signatures, and the meticulous daily maintenance of double-entry ledgers.
And yet, amidst this high-level, highly abstract sedentary banking, Padron casually inserts a note attempting to locate the Cremovesi brothers.
Oh, I love this detail.
Right. He writes that he will deliver a specific message to them whenever they happen to appear in Augsburg. It's easy to read this letter and imagine a fully modernized, entirely sedentary financial system of quiet offices and neat ledgers. But the Cremovesi brothers shatter that illusion.
Because they are itinerant fair merchants.
Yes. They are the older, highly mobile complement to Padron's stationary counting house. They travel the grueling seasonal trade fair circuit, dragging their physical goods on carts through the mud, carrying their ledgers in leather satchels.
Shows the reality on the ground.
Their casual inclusion in the letter proves that this highly evolved paper clearinghouse still relied entirely on a hybrid system. The stationary bankers needed the mobile merchants to physically push the goods through the terrestrial arteries of the continent.
To truly comprehend the gravity of the transactions detailed in this letter, we have to execute a profound sociological comparison. We must translate Padrone's abstract merchant florins into the brutal, physical reality of 18th century labor.
The wage gap.
Yes. If you examine the municipal wage data for the early 1770s, the economic disparity is terrifying. An unskilled day laborer working tirelessly from sunrise to sunset in a city like Augsburg or Nuremberg earned an annual cash income of roughly 35 to 40 florins.
That barely covered bread and basic shelter for a year.
Exactly. Even a highly skilled master artisan, a master mason or a master weaver with their own workshop, might earn between 80 and 125 florins in a year of continuous grueling labor.
Now compare those daily lived realities to the ink on Padrone's letter. He casually processes a single consolidated draft of 616 florins. We have to impress upon you the immense, almost incomprehensible scale of this wealth gap.
It represents lifetimes of work.
A single, routine mercantile transaction moving across Padrone's desk on a standard Tuesday morning represented over a decade and a half of a laborer's total life output, or half a decade of a master artisan's absolute maximum earning potential.
It really contextualizes the paperwork.
The flawless, frictionless paper architecture we are praising was sustained by an intense, highly organized concentration of capital that the vast majority of the European population could not even begin to fathom.
Having established the exact mechanics of this financial network and the staggering capital it moved, we must now explore the ideological bedrock that allowed it to function at all.
It's the issue of trust.
Yes. How did Catholic Venetians like Merthi, Lutheran Germans in Nuremberg, and Sephardic Jews operating in the Levantine trade universally trust one another across this immense network, especially in an era still deeply scarred by the wars of religion?
That profound trust was engineered and strictly enforced by the foundational Venetian state motto, Veneziani prima, poi Cristiani, Venetians first, Christians second.
We must understand the exact mechanism of this phrase. It is not, as some contemporary critics claimed, an expression of atheism or a lack of genuine Catholic faith among the populace.
Not at all.
It is the absolute, unyielding legal assertion of strict secular state primacy. The Republic formally declared that its territorial sovereignty, its commercial networks, and its civic laws answered to the Doge and the Senate alone.
The ecclesiastical authority of Rome was strictly and legally confined to spiritual matters.
Exactly. The Pope had absolutely no jurisdiction over the ledger or the shipyard.
To enforce this secular supremacy, the Republic instituted a unique, deeply cynical magistracy, the Savia Larizia, the sages on heresy. In almost every other Catholic monarchy in Europe, the Roman Inquisition operated with terrifying, lethal autonomy.
Burning books, burning people.
Right. But in Venice, the state legally mandated that these patrician magistrates physically sit in the room during every single Inquisition trial held on Venetian soil.
And their presence was not merely symbolic. They possessed the absolute, unquestionable power to veto any proceeding, to halt any torture, and to dismiss any charge.
They were the ultimate override switch.
Their explicit state function was to ensure that the religious seal of the Holy Office never, under any circumstances, interfered with the commercial, intellectual, or diplomatic machinery of the Republic. They actively protected the multi-confessional merchant base because the Senate understood that complex trans-Mediterranean commerce required absolute religious stability and legal predictability, not ideological purity.
The ultimate dramatic test of this architecture of tolerance, the moment the system was pushed to the absolute brink, occurred during the Interdict of 1606. This was a monumental existential clash between the Republic of Venice and the sitting pontiff, Pope Paul V.
The Pope was infuriated by a series of Venetian laws, specifically laws that severely restricted the Church's ability to accumulate untaxed real estate within the lagoon, and by the Senate's refusal to hand over 2 clergymen accused of common crimes to the ecclesiastical courts.
Venice insisted they face secular justice.
Right. So in retaliation, the Pope unleashed the ultimate spiritual weapon in the Catholic arsenal. He placed the entire Republic under interdict.
Which is a devastating decree.
It meant excommunicating the entire Senate and strictly forbidding the administration of the sacraments, the celebration of Mass, and the burial of the dead in consecrated ground across all Venetian territory. For any other Catholic monarchy of the era, this would trigger an immediate catastrophic collapse of state authority and massive peasant revolts.
But Doge Leonardo Dona stood utterly defiant. He essentially called the Pope's bluff. The Doge issued a strict state mandate ordering all clergy within the Republic's borders to ignore the papal interdict and continue conducting Mass as usual.
Under penalty of death.
Exactly, under penalty of immediate death for treason against the Republic. And when the Society of Jesus, the powerful Jesuit order, refused the Doge and chose to obey Rome, the Republic did not hesitate or negotiate.
They simply purged them.
They expelled the entire Jesuit order from Venetian territory in a single day, loading them onto boats and permanently confiscating their vast, lucrative property.
The intellectual architect of this magnificent defiance was Paolo Sarpi, a brilliant Servite friar who served as the official state theologian of the Republic. Sarpi masterfully argued, through highly circulated pamphlets across the courts of Europe, that the Pope held absolutely no temporal jurisdiction over sovereign states.
He systematically humiliated the papacy in print.
He did. And because of his devastating effectiveness, Sarpi was explicitly targeted for assassination by partisans of the Roman Curia. In a coordinated attack, he was viciously stabbed in the narrow streets of Venice, left for dead with a stiletto deeply embedded in his face.
And as he miraculously survived this brutal attack, while recovering with the scars on his face, his response became the ultimate testament to Venetian defiance. Examining the blade that nearly killed him, he famously stated to his surgeons, "Agnosco stylum Romana curiae." I recognize the style of the Roman Curia.
Is an incredible quote, and this fierce, bloody protection of secular sovereignty yielded magnificent historical fruits over the centuries. It was this exact ideological shield that allowed the University of Padua, located firmly on Venetian soil, to shelter a mind like Galileo Galilei during his most productive years.
Keeping him safe and funded far from the reach of the Roman censors.
Exactly. It was this precise legal framework that allowed the Aldane Press in Venice to freely print and distribute scientific and philosophical books that were strictly banned by the Index of Prohibited Books everywhere else in Catholic Europe.
But as historians, we must analyze the tragic shift in this timeline. The embedded tolerance that made Venice a unique, highly profitable haven for brilliant minds and multi-confessional commerce in the 16th and 17th centuries was no longer a unique advantage by the time Padron sat down to write his letters in 1772.
Exactly. The geographic center of the historical innovation race had migrated. The Protestant North, specifically booming cities like Amsterdam and London, had deeply absorbed the institutional innovations that Venice had originally pioneered.
They took the Venetian playbook.
They took the joint stock company, the public bank, and the clearinghouse, and they layered them into their own dynamic Calvinist and state-backed legal frameworks. By 1772, the unique competitive advantage of Venetian counting house tolerance had been entirely overtaken by the robust institutional protections of the Dutch Republic and the rising British Empire.
Venice was a brilliant pioneer that had been thoroughly, irreversibly surpassed by its own best students.
It had.
This historical displacement brings us to the final, most chilling phase of our investigation. We must move from what these two archival letters flawlessly orchestrated to what they failed to see entirely. When staring at the archive, we must examine the silences.
It is a fundamental rule of our profession. When analyzing primary documents, what is missing is often far more critical than what is written in ink. In August of 1772, merely months after Padron penned his correspondence regarding telescopes in Florence, the first partition of Poland is formally ratified.
Which we mentioned earlier.
Right. Russia, Prussia, and Austria violently carve up massive swaths of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is one of the most seismic, disruptive geopolitical earthquakes of the entire 18th century. Millions of subjects and vast resources change hands.
Yet, if you read Padron's ledgers, there is absolute deafening silence regarding Poland. There's no mention of the territory, the besieged cities, the rapidly shifting borders, or the disrupted trade routes.
Why is there such a profound absence of this massive geopolitical event in the correspondence of highly informed merchants?
Primarily because the Italo-German axis, the specific Augsburg-Nuremberg-Venice corridor they managed, was an entirely separate, insulated commercial circuit from the Polish trade zone.
It was a bubble.
Exactly. Padron's network dealt in Mediterranean textiles and German manufacturers. It did not intersect with the massive Baltic or Galician grain and timber routes disrupted by the partition. Furthermore, technically, the letters predate the final treaty in August.
But on a much more profound level, the silence reflects something deeper.
It reflects the tragic reality of a highly efficient, closed regional system that is utterly oblivious to the shifting, violent macro orders surrounding and enclosing it.
To understand the true vulnerability of this oblivious system, we have to introduce the Harvard historian Sven Beckert's concept of war capitalism. We must aggressively contrast Padrone's comfortable reality in Augsburg with the brutal new global paradigm that was actively replacing him.
Padrone is the ultimate, perfected practitioner of traditional merchant capitalism. His world is peaceful, regional, based on mutual trust, enforced by legal arbitration, and relies on the careful, mathematically precise movement of hundreds of florins across the Alps.
It is highly civilized.
But the global economy of 1772 is no longer defined by merchant capitalism. The rules have changed. The New World Order is defined entirely by war capitalism.
And the mechanism of war capitalism is the aggressive, lethal integration of private mercantile wealth with the overwhelming coercive military power of massive centralizing nation-states.
It is the marriage of the ledger and the naval cannon.
Exactly. While Padrone sits safely in his Augsburg counting house, arranging the polite transfer of 616 florins, the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean is generating tens of millions of pounds through the brutal, systematic, industrialized exploitation of enslaved African labor on massive sugar plantations.
Simultaneously, on the other side of the globe, the British East India Company is utilizing massive private armies and naval squadrons to violently extract the immense terrestrial wealth of Bengal,
Directly dictating terms to local rulers through the barrel of a musket.
This new Atlantic and global economy does not rely on polite transalpine clearinghouses. It relies on aggressive territorial conquest, heavily gunned oceanic navies capable of projecting power across hemispheres, and the forced, violent acquisition of global commodity frontiers.
And this is exactly where the paradox of Venice finally collapses. Venice, permanently constrained by the shallow mudbanks of its lagoon, entirely lacking the vast demographic mass required to field massive territorial armies, and ideologically committed to the passive defense of armed neutrality, was structurally, fundamentally incapable of competing in this brutal new global paradigm.
They could not project the totalizing, coercive state violence required to participate in war capitalism.
No, they were outscaled, outgunned, and functionally obsolete on the world stage, even as their regional paper ledgers remained flawlessly, perfectly balanced.
And that leads us to reflect on the profound, dramatic irony saturating the ink of these two letters. The merchants corresponding in the late winter of 1772 were executing their daily duties with absolute precision, utilizing a magnificent institutional architecture that had reliably functioned for centuries.
Because the machines still worked perfectly on a Tuesday, they had absolutely no idea the end of their entire civilization was near.
When you look at the wage data, the ledgers, and the geopolitical maps, a terrifying historical reality emerges. Consider how deeply entrenched, unshakable systems of commerce and trust systems built meticulously, brick by brick, law by law, over 500 years, can simply vanish entirely within a single human generation when the geopolitical paradigm shifts from peaceful arbitration to total war.
It is a sobering thought.
The merchants of 1772 believed their perfectly balanced ledgers and their quiet counting houses would endure forever. They could not see the massive conscripted armies of the Napoleonic era already forming on the horizon, ready to sweep their entire world, their republic, and their perfect machinery into the archives of history.
Thank you for your attention. We hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next episode.